Hello, and welcome to the Mothers of All Crime. This is a podcast where we deep dive into mothers involved in infamous crimes and scandals. I'm Monica, and this is Crystal. This week on the Mothers of All Crime, we're going to be talking about Andrea Yates. She was born Andrea Pia Kennedy, July 3rd, 1964, in Texas. And we're just going to talk a little bit about her early life and marriage. She was a very intelligent kid, and she was valedictorian of her high school class. There were some rumors, and there have been some statements later that she had some mental struggles. She was always very shy. She had some issues with bulimia and had expressed some thoughts about depression, suicidality as a teenager. But it wasn't debilitating by any means. And she went to college and became a nurse. Seems she did really well academically. So definitely an intelligent person.
Yeah, no, she was super smart. And listen, I give anyone who could become a nurse credit because that is just verbiage that goes over so many people's heads, and you have to know where all these things connect. Well, like you said, she was valedictorian.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at her in the early years as like a snapshot, she was
Hmm.
captain of the swim team, she was an
Hmm.
honor society, she could have been appeared as like a very like well-liked person, kind of popular, but like shy at the same time. So it's interesting as time went on, like the mentions of some mental health struggles and bulimia kind of going with the image of like what everybody else thinks of her. Um,
Hmm.
I think it just foreshadows. We obviously know what happens, but I think it foreshadows a lot of things coming up. And those were never addressed as a child. It was just part of her life.
Yes. I mean, it seems that so I read a book written by a journalist who covered the Andrea Yates case, and I read it years ago, and I reread it in preparation for this. It's called "Are You There Alone" by Suzanne O'Malley, and in that, Rusty, her husband, eventually was interviewed many times, and he had said that in Andrea's family, you weren't allowed to have any needs, and no one was able to express their needs or concerns to each other. They don't talk about anything. They grew up in a very religious home, a Catholic family where things were kept very close to the chest. Nobody had any problems, and we don't talk about anything. That's just the way that Andrea was raised, essentially.
Yeah. And I do think it's important to mention she was like a first generation immigrant too,
Mhm.
where I don't think that's super abnormal in those kind of families because, listen, I love the fact that the United States is very mental health supportive, but that's not the norm in the world. Where I don't think it's abnormal if her parents grew up listen, you keep it inside yourself. If you just pretend it's not there, it's not there, and
Yeah.
you tough it out. I think her being taught that was just them, that's how they were raised and how their family was raised. So it wasn't like intentionally putting her down, but it was very normal in the culture I think she grew up in.
Yeah. I mean, she was the youngest of five kids, and her mother is a German immigrant and had married her father when he was in the military overseas in Germany. And I think that she brought a lot of her culture with her, and she had converted to Catholicism when she married Andrea's father. And I think a lot of times converts are more religious and take the rules very seriously because they're coming to
Yeah.
them as an adult. So I think that there was just, there was a culture in the way that she was raised. And I think being the youngest of five kids, you maybe are lost in the sauce a little bit. There's just a
Sure.
lot of a lot of kids.
Oh, absolutely. And I think she was very comfortable with religion and it was raised that way, which is where her soon to be husband, who was also very religious, made it very easy for them to kind of come together.
Yes. She met so Andrea Kennedy met Rusty Yates at a swimming pool in the apartment complex that they lived in. He was a NASA engineer, which is also very impressive,
Mm-hmm.
and he basically instantly loved Andrea, thought she was beautiful, thought she was amazing. He introduced her to his religious mentors, and who are pretty extreme, devout evangelical Christians. That's who they're called, the Warreneckis. That's their last name. They travel full time in RVs and they spread the word. And Rusty had met them while they were preaching on a college campus, and he became very involved in that religion and was born again as a Christian. And he believed in many things that are pretty extreme to me, but one of them is that you should have as many children as God allows you to, and that's a pretty common belief in that circle. And
And I think that also resonated with her. Like most old school Catholics don't believe in birth control anyway. She was one of
right,
many children. So I think it was easy for her to, she already had a very like deep religious understanding, and him being more extreme was a very like, it was an easier step than for someone who didn't grow up the way she did.
I agree with that. I think she had the basis, she had the knowledge, but she just hadn't had the passion and the fervor for it that Rusty had. And she saw it through his eyes and really embraced his faith and was much more serious about it eventually than he was. I do want to mention, though, that she felt a lot of guilt when they were living together before getting married. And I think that that is kind of interesting that they did that.
I was shocked on that. Absolutely shocked.
Yeah, it was kind of a big point of contention, and she was on the birth control pill while they lived together premaritally.
Also, very surprising to me because it was one, I would assume that they would have, just from their religious standpoints, like rushed into getting married, got married quickly, and immediately were like, okay, we got to have babies now, was my original thought. And then learning that they did those things, like it just seemed very contradictory to me.
Yeah, I mean, they knew each other for like almost 4 years by the time they actually got married. And he didn't propose, like, it was over 3 years from the time they met before he proposed because they got married within a year of him proposing. So to me, that's not a crazy timeline, but I think for very religious people in Texas, that seems a bit drawn out. Seems pretty long.
Right. I think it's the religious thing and also like the timing of things. Us waiting 3 years, I think in this day and age is so normal
Hmm.
versus our parents' age and grandparents' age, because she's 60 now.
Right.
Um, that that was a long time. I don't think,
Yeah.
like looking back, like my grandparents in their early 70s, they definitely dated for less than that and then got married versus like now I can't even imagine getting married in a year after meeting someone. That seems wild.
It
But it
does seem wild.
happens.
It seems really fast. I know people still do it, but I think that in 1993, it was less common to live together before marriage. It was less common to have long courtships in their religions. So I just think it's interesting that they
Yeah.
went that route, but I don't think Rusty was in a huge rush. Andrea was, though, and she felt a lot of guilt and shame about them living together in sin. But there's,
Shocking. The woman's the one who feels guilt about the shame and the
I
sex.
know. Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I feel like she was kind of pressured into moving in with him. I don't know that that was her preference. She had another significant relationship prior to Rusty that's mentioned in the book, and they broke up because she didn't want to have premarital sex when she was like 23 or 24. I think that she kind of gave in with Rusty, lack of a better words, maybe. Because I do think she wanted to be with him. I just don't think that he really like respected the premarital sex rule as much as he seems to love other rules in their religion. And he he made it clear that that was not really an option by wanting to live together before getting married, that they weren't waiting until marriage.
Yeah. He I have some theories on him that I'm going to bring up later, but he definitely was. the leader of the house. He definitely
Hmm.
was the guy where it's my way or the highway. And I think she really did love him and just looked at it like, I need to submit to my future husband, kind of at the moment,
Yeah.
where she wanted it to happen. And the only way that it was going to was to follow his instructions.
Yes, that's very true because in their evangelical religion, women are not just submissive as wives, they are submissive helpmates in general. Like women in
Yeah, submissive
general
to men. Hmm.
exactly are supposed to be constantly just doing things for the benefit of men, which is, I guess for Rusty would sounds pretty good, but yeah, I don't know how well that was working out for Andrea in the beginning because she was just submitting to whatever he wanted. And that came up in a
Yeah.
lot of different instances because when they first were married, they had bought, well, Rusty had bought a 4 bedroom home, and then they ended up selling that and moving into a little camper van. And they did that kind of on and off, living in trailers, living in camper vans, living in an RV, living in a motorhome until, I mean, they did that for a while. They had that with they had their first baby within a year of them getting married. They got married. She went off the birth control pill, got pregnant right away, had their first child right away.
Hmm.
And so that was Noah. And then they had up to 4 children. They had their fourth kid, Luke, and they were still living in that tiny little trailer home. And when you look at the descriptions of where they lived, it was like a 2 bedroom, teeny tiny, cramped space where she just has all of these kids, and they're all so young because they were all born back to back. So she just has like
Hmm.
4 babies living in a teeny tiny little place together. And she had immediately quit her job when she had Noah, the first kid. She worked up until a couple of days before having him, and then she never went back to work because her new thing was that she was going to be a full time mom, a full time wife, that she was going to homeschool the kids, that they were going to be brought up in this very religious, very devout environment. And like that
Again,
was the plan.
very on track and on
Hmm.
trend with what their beliefs were. So, listen, to each his own. Being a stay-at-home mom with 5 children, that is a full-time job. Let's be honest here. Particularly 5 children
Absolutely.
under the age of 8. Like,
Yeah.
holy cow. I don't you can't work and do that at the same time. Like reality, unless you're hiring help. And the amount of money that it would have been her whole salary to put these kids into any kind of care anyway. So, but there was no way he was going to be the one staying at home. So, time to submit.
That certainly was not an option. Um, So they, so it was going okay up until the point of Luke, the fourth child being born. There were always problems, mental health problems that Andrea was having, but they were manageable, managed, ignored, whatever you want to say,
Hmm.
up until Luke was born, and she
Yeah.
started
So we
having,
had Noah, John, Paul, and then Luke, all back to
right,
back. Very
yes,
biblical.
all very biblical names. I actually really like them, but they're
You
very
don't hear
biblical
a lot
names.
of Pauls.
Yeah. I don't know. I like all these names. But they are very biblical,
Yeah, I agree.
disciples of Jesus kind of names, which makes sense, We know where they were getting their inspiration. And I
Oh
think
yeah.
that, you know, one of the things that Andrea would do when she was having like a depressive episode is she would obsessively read the Bible. So I think that these were names that she was coming across a lot. Um, so she had had depressive episodes, but she never had nervous breakdowns or suicide attempts until after Luke was born. She
Yeah.
tried 2 different times to kill herself within like a couple of weeks of each other of that. So I think, sorry, I'm just looking at my
Yeah,
timeline
the
here.
suicide attempts were with pills too. She tried to
Hmm.
OD
Yes.
and ended up being hospitalized for each attempt,
Hmm.
and then prescribed antidepressants. which
Right.
were supposedly supposed to help.
Right. So yeah, okay. So I'm looking at it now. And so she overdosed on pills, was hospitalized. She was prescribed antidepressants. She was released.
Hmm.
And within a day of that release from the hospital, she was trying to cut her own throat and
Yeah.
was begging Rusty to let her die and to just like look away and, whatever. So she was doing this in front of him, was hospitalized again. And that's when she was first started on antipsychotics.
Yep.
And Haldol is a very important medication that comes up many, many times in this case because she did improve so drastically and so quickly after starting the Haldol, that it was kind of looked at as like a miracle drug. And she was doing a lot better and she was very cognizant. So she seemed to have a massive improvement. She's stable on that, but she was not very compliant with taking medication in general. So one of the benefits of Haldol is that it can be injected, and so that
Hmm.
is something that can be really controlled through a physician. She would have to go to the office every 3 weeks and get a shot, which worked a lot better for her because while she was in the hospital and while she was home, the doctors, Rusty, they would try to give her medication and she would cheek it. She would put it under her tongue. She would throw it up. She would spit it out. She would say that she took it when she didn't take it. She was taking half doses of medications. So it was easier for compliance sake to have it be in an injectable form.
Yeah. And that's not uncommon for people who end up being diagnosed with some kind of psychosis
Hmm.
where there's so many different reasons, but some of it goes with they start feeling normal again and they feel like they don't need it anymore. So they would just stop taking it, not realizing the entire reason that they feel better is because of the medication.
Yeah.
And sometimes people didn't like the way that the side effects affected them, or the voices were telling them that it was poison. Like, there's so many reasons people don't do it, but it is very, very common.
Definitely. It's super common, and I think that it makes sense because you're not thinking from a logical point of view anyway. Like things have already gone awry to the point that you're now needing antipsychotics. And I think that it's hard to allow medications to build up to therapeutic doses for people who are struggling with much less severe issues than she was. Like her brain was really working against her and trying to convince her that she wasn't really sick and that she's just being she's not being submissive and she's not being a good wife and she's not being a good mother and that she's just not living up to what she should be as a Christian woman. So I think that she had convinced herself that medication wasn't the real solution and she just needed to be better, um, which is really sad, but I think that's also very common,
Yeah.
especially in cases of postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis. There's a lot of diagnoses that are thrown around with Andrea Yates, and it's hard to
Hmm.
say what a true diagnosis for her should be. I mean, obviously,
Sure.
we don't have access to her full medical records, nor should we, but I'm not sure what diagnosis I'm comfortable saying that she definitely has, but I think that she demonstrated psychosis and severe depression for sure. Like those are not you can't argue about
Yeah.
that.
And I think also you got my perspective is from a obviously non-medical side is she probably was being diagnosed with that specific hospitalization because unfortunately she had so many. So she had one ODing on pills. She had one when she held a knife to her throat. A month later she had a nervous breakdown. And it I think each time she went in they were just trying to stabilize that circumstance,
Hmm.
which is where all of the different diagnoses come out. Like it was July of 1999 when she got a quote officially diagnosed with postpartum psychosis, but previously was on different medications for depression and psychosis, and like I think it was just the doctors were trying to consistently just address whatever that moment was.
Yeah. And they had a really hard time keeping her in a facility. There were several times that Andrea was discharged earlier than the doctors or her husband were comfortable with, but insurance had run out. They'd hit maximums of how many days you can be hospitalized. So I think that that is a whole other conversation, but it is a contributing factor here because if she had just been able to stay until she was truly stable, as opposed to when the insurance felt like she should have been stable, I do think that that would have been very different. I don't think that she should have been released until she could have gone a significant amount of time without a suicide attempt. I don't think that it made sense to keep sending her back to the same environment. I mean, after her first attempt, Rusty did go out and buy a house because he thought that that would help. And it did seem to help
Mhm.
temporarily because they did have more space and everybody wasn't so on top of each other. But otherwise, nothing in the situation's really changing. The families are becoming involved and are helping out with the kids and stuff like that while Andrea is hospitalized. Everyone was pretty supportive, but
Um, I don't know. I think,
physically,
yeah, I think the support is tough because I have seen a couple things when it comes to her husband. I do think there were some times where it was because of insurance, but I also think a lot of it is after the fact where he there's contradictory statements where he's saying I didn't want to have her discharged and the doctors are saying we had conversations and he was bringing her home if we were against our advice.
mm,
So I think there definitely were circumstances that he was doing his best to help his wife, but I also think there's a lot of gray because the she can't really defend herself because she's quote labeled crazy at this point.
right,
Where the sane quote person, is standing there saying, "Nope, never said that. I want my wife stable and healthy." But then you
right.
have doctors saying, "I told you not to have bring her home and you brought her home anyway." Like
Well,
so
I definitely think that he engages in some magical thinking after the fact, which we can
yeah.
definitely get into. There was definitely a recommendation that was made clear to him, made clear to Andrea after all of these things happened after Luke was born, and Andrea was so sick, so
Mhm.
psychotic, so severely depressed, had multiple suicide attempts, multiple hospitalizations, was a true risk to herself. They were told not to have any more children. And while you're on Haldol, you shouldn't get pregnant. So she was on birth control while she was on Haldol. She had stabilized. And her psychiatrist, who is Dr. Starbranch, told them literally, quote, it would guarantee future psychotic depression to have more children.
Yep.
Rusty was told that. Andrea was told that. And yet she stopped taking Haldol within a few weeks of her discharge from the hospital and had a baby within 10 months of that, which
Mhm.
is the fifth kid, Mary, the only girl.
Little Mary.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's where I start feeling icky about his involvement. And we could talk about this part after we kind of go through the rest of the case, but that's where I start feeling icky with him specifically.
Yeah, yes, because it does seem like he convinced her that it wasn't a real problem and that this was their religious duty was to continue to have children. And if God wanted them to have more children, he would give them more children. And
Hmm.
that's what they can handle is whatever God thinks they can handle. Um, it's just it's hard to wrap my head around personally that you could be
Yeah,
given such a direction, like such a strict instruction like that from a doctor and just completely disregard it and oh it'll be fine. It hasn't been fine. So I don't know why they thought it would be fine.
right.
Um, but yeah, I mean, she was okay during the pregnancy, though. By all accounts, she was much better. She was in a much higher spirit, and she did seem totally fine while she was pregnant. But that is also something that sometimes happens with mental illnesses and with physical illnesses. Sometimes during pregnancy, they go into a remission. That happens with lupus, that happens with migraines, it happens with asthma. There's all kinds of things that they can get worse while you're pregnant, but for some people they really experience a time of remission, and it changes a lot of things about how your body works, and your hormones are so different. And I just think it is not surprising to me that she was in a different place mentally and physically while she was pregnant, but soon after having the baby, it was getting right back to how she had been before. Um,
And
yeah,
on overdrive. Yeah.
on overdrive. And I think that it was much worse after her father passed away. Andrea's father had Alzheimer's, he had dementia, he'd been very, very sick for a long time. And she had helped nurse him, she had helped her mother take care of him, she had been with him all of the time. One of her overdoses were using his sleeping pills in her parents' home. But when he passed away, she stopped taking the antidepressant she was supposed to be on. She would just walk around with baby Mary in her arms, refusing to feed her, and would just pace with her for hours and hours. And she started becoming nonverbal and catatonic, and she would just sit and stare for hours and hours again. And she would seem to be reacting to stimulus that no one else was aware of. So she
Mm.
was hospitalized again. Um, and or yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, she
And then
was.
on top of all that, yeah, she was also mutilating herself.
Hmm.
The one time she did try, like, quote, try to feed her baby, she gave her solid, this is a 6 month old,
Yeah.
gave her solid food, and the baby almost choked. And
Hmm.
like, there was this whole ordeal. And she again went back to that consistent overdrive of reading the Bible.
Right.
And I think that was kind of that other knowledge of like, hey, she went from reading it normally to obsessively, which was just showing that she's regressing back into those, trying to find comfort somewhere else and stability,
Right.
and just not being able to. And
Right.
that was what, March of 2001, I think, when her father passed away.
Yeah. March 12th, 2001.
Yeah.
Um, and then May 3rd was a pretty significant day in 2001. Andrea filled up the bathtub and was being extremely weird about it. She was not explaining to her mother-in-law who was there. She wasn't explaining to Rusty why she had filled with the bathtub if she was not going to take a bath. It
Yeah, it
later
was like the
came out
middle of
that
the day. Middle of the
yeah,
day, just filled it up. Listen, I love a good afternoon bath. Who doesn't? But like,
but she didn't get in.
very out of character too for her, where she
Yeah.
just stood there.
I
Like,
mean, she only ever took showers. Also, she wasn't a bath person, so
yeah, I
everyone
don't.
thought that was pretty weird.
I love a
And
good bath.
at that point, her mother-in-law had come to Texas because she didn't actually live there. Rusty's mom had come for a visit, had seen how sick Andrea had become, and had started staying in the area and was coming over every day while Rusty was at work to watch the kids and watch Andrea because she was not supposed to, under doctor's instructions, was not supposed to be alone with the children. Um,
Yes.
so that was going okay for a little while. And then Rusty had decided and announced at a family party that he was going to start having his mother come an hour later in the morning to give Andrea an hour with the kids by herself so that she could increase her independence and feel more confident as a mom and be, in charge of more parenting things, and so that his mother wasn't going to be so exhausted, had a lot of different reasons. Um,
I think
so,
another really important one that he also put out there was that he felt that his wife was becoming completely dependent on him and his mother
mhm,
when achieving her maternal responsibilities. So, in a manner of speaking, he basically was saying like she was being a bad mom. She wasn't doing her job, and she was making her husband and his mom do it for her. And I think he had a problem with that.
I think he did too. I think that Rusty didn't really. I think that he overall was pretty supportive while she was hospitalized. He would come every day. He would get her to eat. Like she would
Mm-hmm.
refuse meals. She would sometimes have 50 calories a day. And he would come and he would sit with her for 2 hours and make her drink an Ensure, give her a chocolate milk. He would bring the kids. He would drive an hour each way to visit her at the facility every single day. He was giving her medications at home. He was trying, but I think that he had become very frustrated with the ongoing drama,
Mm-hmm.
um, and he was losing sympathy for it. And I think that he felt his mother was doing too much for Andrea, that she was just stepping in and doing everything for her, and that she was more capable than she was seeming to be, I guess. I think
Yeah.
he thought
And
that she could do more.
I agree. And I also think that in his family, there seemed to be this perception that like mental health, similar to her family, mental health really isn't something that should stop you. Like you
Hmm.
should just get over it.
Hmm.
His brother did an interview that he said that depressed people just need a swift kick in the pants to motivate them and they're fine. Like if
Yeah.
you're clinically depressed, I I wish that was the answer, but
Hmm.
not normally what works. You have his mother probably becoming a little resentful. You have him basically fed up, and I think he did a good job presenting as the caring, loving husband. But when it came back to like just in their home, I don't know. It just, as things started coming out, I think he felt like she should have just got over it. I think she was being, in his eyes, dramatic and didn't want to
Hmm.
be a good mom and should have just figured it out. And she just couldn't. As much as she tried, she just couldn't.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And I think that she did a lot of things to just try to please him. And I don't think that she was honest about some of the issues that she was having, but I think that he also was choosing not to see what he didn't want to see
Mm-hmm.
in a very scary, detrimental way. I definitely agree with you, though, that I think his mom was becoming resentful, or at least Rusty was resentful on her behalf.
Yeah.
Prior to Andrea's father's death, her mother had been pretty helpful and involved, even though there are issues, just like, any family has issues, but she was grieving, she was dealing with a lot, she wasn't as available, and it was all kind of falling on Dora, Rusty's mom, and I don't think that Rusty felt that was fair. And yeah, so they
Yeah.
were leaving
So for
her
a
with the kids
couple,
for an hour.
yeah, and that was going on for like a couple weeks that he just
Right, yeah.
on his own against medical advice decided that they were going to start doing this.
Yes. And Andrea's mom was horrified at the prospect.
Rightfully so, honestly.
Hmm. Yeah.
And unfortunately, this is why you're supposed to listen to doctors, particularly psychiatrists. Like, if you're going to ignore any doctor, I don't think that's the one you should ignore, personally.
I mean, not after multiple hospitalizations and suicide attempts and antipsychotics.
Yeah,
This is not this is not a minor issue that's happening here. This is like a repetitive major depression. Um, yeah, and this is why we're even talking about her now, because what Andrea Yates is famous for is drowning her 5 children in the bathtub. Um, so she
on in
she
June
drowned
of
them.
2001.
Yeah, she drowned them each individually, um, and put 4 of them in the master bed, and she left Noah, the oldest one, in the tub. She called 911 and told them that she had just killed her kids. And, but I mean, it took a really long time. I've listened to the call and I've read the transcripts of it. It took a very long time for them to get that information out of her. She just kept saying, I need an officer. I need an officer.
Yeah,
I don't need an ambulance. I need an officer.
yeah.
Um, and then she called Rusty at NASA and told him to come home.
And also didn't
And
tell him why, just come home.
right. And she had called once before when he was at work and said that he needed to come home right away, and he had found her having a nervous breakdown, and that was one of her hospitalizations. So, he got the call at work, he left immediately, he came home, and there were cop cars and an ambulance, a whole lot of people at the house, and he wasn't allowed in and was told on the front yard that all five of his kids had passed away.
God, how devastating. I think
Devastating.
when it comes to this one, it is interesting how she chose to drown them and arrange them
Hmm.
because she started off with Paul, John, and Luke, who were the middle three,
Right.
and took them, put them on the bed, and kind of arranged them very lovingly, like little dolls, I think is the best way for me to describe it. Then Noah just happened, and Mary was also there, but Mary just, she left her there floating in the bathtub while she was arranging the three boys. And her eldest had came in, saw what's happening, and tried to escape, but obviously a 7-year old is not going to really succeed in that.
Yeah.
Um, she grabbed him, brought him back into the bathroom, drowned him, put Mary in the arms of her older brother, John,
Hmm.
on the bed, and then left Noah in the bathtub.
Yeah.
And I think what's peculiar to me about that is it seems to be the trigger of the moment. So in her brain, and I'm curious if you what if how this tracks with you. So Paul, John, and Luke were like the the three that didn't do anything wrong. And I think she went after them first, and then Mary in her brain was the last, which caused a lot of this issues and it caused a lot of the psychosis. Like being left in that bathtub, like blaming her until Noah came in, and I think her anger or psychosis turned on him, and then that's why he got left. Like it was the whoever was left was the reason that it like the tipping scale, I feel. Because not
So
once
I
were any issues with Paul. There was never any mentions that I could find.
so she I think that she had a lot of problems after John's birth and Luke's birth. Not so much with Noah and Paul. With Noah, it seems pretty minimal, but I think that she
Yeah.
also had just like way less kids to deal with at that point. She only had the one.
Right.
Um, After Paul's birth, she supposedly was totally fine though, and was like in a blissful kind of a state after that. Um, and then obviously she did have these issues with Mary. I feel like for me, I think that the reason that she left Noah the way that she did and arranged the other kids is because Noah resisted the most. He fought back the
Mm-hmm.
hardest. He made it very difficult, and I think that she just was done at that point and didn't bother, which it, I think it's more about him just resisting a lot, and she
Yeah.
just like left him, and the other kids were way easier to dominate because they were just not as strong, and so she wasn't drained by doing that necessarily. It's also, to me, it's important to mention she did all of this within about 45 minutes. So, I mean, to drown five kids and arrange them all and call, like, it just seems like she was doing this pretty fast. And I mean, she definitely could have put Noah in the bed. I'm not sure why she didn't, but I just feel like she was resentful of the effort that that took.
Yeah. And well, this all occurred within an hour
Yeah.
because she had so her husband had left and had
Hmm.
scheduled his mom to come in 1 hour. And in that time period, she waited until her husband left to fill up the bathtub because she claims that she knew if he was there, he would have tried to stop her, and locked up the dog and admitted that like the dog used to just roam around. Like it was not
Hmm.
typically caged.
Right.
So she caged the dog, filled the bathtub, and then very quickly drowned all of her children, called the police, called her husband, all before her mother-in-law showed up.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I was saying it was like 45 minutes because it wasn't even the full hour. I mean, Dora had arrived by the time Rusty arrived and was also told about all the kids while she was standing outside with the police. But yeah, it'd been less than an hour. I did think it was really interesting that the dog had been crated because normally it wasn't. But
I
she thought
think
that
it
the
was
dog would protect the kids,
inter
basically.
I don't even know if it was like protect the kids, but interference, like one more thing you had to worry about
Hmm.
because God, our dog like follows me around like a piece of Velcro attached to
That's
me.
true. Me
Let
too.
alone if you're gonna go try and drown somebody, the last thing you need is your dog being not even taking away the fact that he might defend the children, but just being like, "What you doing? Where you going? How about that? Can I come?"
Hmm.
Like, just one more thing that your brain has to try to like corral. And she knew she had an hour. She was
Yeah.
cognitive enough that she's like, "I need to do this efficiently,"
Right.
and that was the easiest way to do it.
Yeah. I always do think it's interesting with family annihilators that usually the dog is spared, um,
As they
which
should.
I appreciate
I'm
on the
just
whole.
kidding.
I'm
Kids'
just
lives are
thinking of like
important.
kids are important too. I'm just thinking of like all of the family annihilators that I can think of off the top of my head had dogs, and the dogs were not included in the killings. And the dogs were often created in a safe place and not involved. Like I'm thinking of Diane Schuler, I'm thinking of Chris Watts. Like there are many different examples of this where people are like, well, not the dog, maybe I'll kill my wife, maybe I'll kill kids, but not the dog, which I am glad because that would have, I mean, this is a horrific situation, but it wouldn't have been helped by her also killing the dog.
Right, exactly. Um, but God, I can't even imagine hearing that
Yeah.
in
And
your front
Rusty
lawn.
And Rusty had tried to convince himself that maybe Noah had been with his mom at the hotel because sometimes the kids would go for like individual sleepovers with the grandma, just get some time, like grandma time alone.
Yeah.
And he knew because he had been there in the morning that Noah was in the house, but he was just like trying to convince himself. And then when he saw his mother, it was confirmed to him that she didn't have any of the kids with her and that they were really all gone. And it is horrific. I mean, this is one of
Yeah.
the worst cases ever that I've ever heard of.
Yeah. So, because at this time, Noah was 7, John was 5, Paul was 3, Luke was 2, and Mary was 6 months at the time that
Hmm.
they died. Which, first of all, not to like make light of the situation, but that age group and that makes me want to be crazy just hearing having to deal with those ages all together. Like
Yeah.
alone, that alone would make someone go crazy. Because have you tried to deal with 3 toddlers, let alone 5?
It
Like,
it's
ugh.
I mean, for most people, I think this would just be way too many kids and way too much going on and they're very, very close in age. And I know people do that, but
Listen, some people can handle it, but I just
I just
clearly,
feel like it was of course an extremely stressful situation, and I think that most people want to be the best parents they can be and they want to provide all of these things for their kids like financially and spiritually and emotionally and it's you're stretching yourself very thin. And if you have a
yeah.
newborn baby that you're breastfeeding, you have all of these kids that you're supposed to be providing education to, religious education, school education, because Noah at least was school aged. And I guess,
Mm-hmm.
the other ones, maybe like some kindergarten, preschool kind of stuff. But Noah wasn't going to school. He was being homeschooled. And the homeschool curriculum had ended the day that Andrea's dad died. The whole curriculum just ended. Like she was
Yeah.
not teaching them anymore. There were so many signs that this was someone who was in a very difficult situation that was struggling, and instead of taking things off of her plate, it just seems like her plate was getting added to and added to and added to because anytime she reached some sort of equilibrium and stability, they had another kid. And now we're
Mm-hmm.
homeschooling them. And now we're living in a van. And it just, there were a lot of things that went terribly, terribly wrong, mostly in her brain, but I also agree her actual life was very stressful and crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we mentioned this, but this did happen in Houston, Texas,
Mm.
which I
Is
think
significant.
is also significant.
Mm.
And when it comes to women as a gender, typically, both in cases of killing someone else or trying to kill yourself, they tend to do it in a kind of peaceful way. You don't often see histories of women doing suicide by gunshots, which is a very popular one with men. They typically are more involved with drownings, overdoses, things of that nature, which is
Hmm.
consistent with how she killed her own children, but also how she tried to kill herself. It was a lot of the most
Yeah.
painless way to do it was what she typically tried to do. And you could argue that it was a way of sympathy where she killed her children in the most quote peaceful way to go. I think drowning is a horrible way to go, but it's less gory, I think is the way that a lot of people try to
Yeah.
describe it for women.
It was not a bloody scene.
Yeah.
It looked like the kids
And
were just
very
sleeping.
arranged and
Yeah.
yeah.
Except for Noah, it
So,
looked like they were all just asleep in the bed.
yeah. So obviously she was arrested and put on trial.
Yeah. And when she was arrested, she said that she was the devil, that the devil was speaking through her. She asked for a razor so that she could shave her head to show the mark of the beast. She was saying all kinds of things like that, but mostly about the devil and Satan
Yeah.
and the
And
prophecy.
right. And then also that her children weren't righteous. And
Hmm.
due to that, it was because she was evil, which is why they
Right.
were not righteous and they were doomed to perish in the fires of hell anyway. So her actions were really to save them.
Right. Well, she
Again,
kept saying repeatedly that they weren't developing correctly and that it was because she had failed them. So this
yeah,
was to ensure that they would go to heaven, basically.
yeah. So during her trial, the first she had two trials because it didn't end up getting
Right.
overturned. But the first one, the county did ask for the death penalty. It was a trial by jury, and they ended up convicting her of capital murder, but not of the death penalty.
Yeah.
Um, Sentenced to life in prison with the ability of parole after 40 years.
Yeah.
And that ended up being overturned on appeal. So the
Yes,
case
which is
happened in
really interesting.
2002. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And I do think it's also like important to just mention that her lawyers had tried to go for an insanity defense and that was rejected. She had a competency hearing that ended up being longer than her actual murder trial, where she was declared competent.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, and that's when she was convicted, 40 years. And yeah, it was, there was an appeal. And I thought that the reason for it was very interesting.
Oh, it's
Um,
kind of funny.
it is funny. It's, I think it's like actually a very good grounds for appeal. And this was something that was almost caused a mistrial during the first trial because it was discovered during that time. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
afterwards. The trial is still going on, which would have probably been better to have a mistrial at that point. But one of the witnesses had said that before the murders, an episode had aired on Law and Order showing a woman that was pretending to be psychotic and drowned her kids in the bathtub and got away with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically implying that Andrea had seen that because she did watch that show and that she was using that as a template for what she was doing.
Yeah.
And the author, Suzanne O'Malley, who wrote the book that I read, was the one that realized that that was not true. She tried to figure out if that episode ever existed, contacted Dick Wolf and a bunch of other people that she knew that worked for Law and Order, and there was no episode like that. So
I mean, further down the line, they did end up airing one similar,
based
but because
on
it was
Andrea
based
Yates.
on, yeah, because it was based
Yeah,
on her.
because this had never
Um,
happened before. Like, this
Yeah,
was
but
unique.
the expert witness started getting called into question by their
Mm-hmm.
testimony, which was a huge conviction foundation. And that's how it got overturned because they decided the expert witness had a false testimony due to this hypothetical law and order issue. Um, and during this trial, which the first trial, her husband seemed to put on this front that he truly believed his wife was innocent, she was going to be found innocent, that she would then go to a treatment facility, she'd get better, they'd released, and then they would have more babies because that's the
Oh,
answer.
oh my gosh. He was saying that they could get a surrogate, they could adopt. You think
Yeah, we'll
anyone's gonna
find new
let you
ways.
adopt?
God, yeah. Let me. Hi, my name's
Oh,
Andrea. I murdered 5 children. Can I have another?
it's so sick. It is
Oh
sick.
yeah.
And I feel like it really shows that Rusty is also not all right
That's
in
what I'm
his
saying.
brain
Yeah, he is
because
in his
she,
own little world of crazy.
I mean, he's so delusional that he doesn't think that the pregnancies or the babies or any of that had anything to do with her mental health. Like, it would be
That
the
she's just
worst
gonna
thing.
she's gonna go back to that treatment facility that, quote, fixed her all the other times, and she's just gonna be
Yeah.
magically better. That's how it works. Yep.
Well, Rusty blames a lot of different factors for what happened. So now Andrea is in a mental health facility because she was, found like not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect at her second trial. So
Yeah. So
she's,
the second
you know,
trial beforehand, she got released on bail, admitted into a
mhm,
mental facility immediately.
yeah,
Went back to trial. The insanity defense was accepted this time, and after a 3-day deliberation, the jury found her not guilty for the reason of insanity, and
right,
then she was sentenced to a high security state hospital.
right. And now she's in a lower security mental facility. Like, that's where she is
Yes.
right now to this day. And
Yep.
but Rusty has all different explanations for what really happened. Partially, he blames the medication. She was on a very high dose of Effexor at the time that she killed the kids, and that there are some side effects that are suicidal and homicidal ideation that are associated with Effexor. So that was one theory. Another was that she had
Mm-hmm.
stopped taking Haldol about 2 weeks prior to the murders, and that was because her doctor at the time had some hesitations about all of the extreme side effects that happen from Haldol. Um, so maybe it was related to that. Maybe her coming off of Haldol, increased her risk for psychosis. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
she was on an extremely high dose of Effexor, so maybe that also played a part. But to me, both of those seem like reasons that she probably still should have been hospitalized at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for me to know where to put blame for that because she was being continuously released. And a lot of it was due to insurance issues. There were
Yep.
also, conflicts with Rusty and his opinions about her medical care, but
Yeah.
she
She
was
also
not stable.
was at one point diagnosed with schizophrenia, which I
Hmm.
think is important to mention just because there are different levels of schizophrenia where you have schizophrenia that could be Joe Schmo that you know at work and has is on his medication, like has nice voices in his head. And then
Hmm.
you have the schizophrenics that you see on TV that have homicidal voices and that are telling and the devil in their head, which of all of the diagnoses, and like we said, there's been a laundry list. We've only mentioned a couple. Um, that one feels the most accurate for me, coupled with the postpartum psychosis,
Yeah,
just because of some of the things that she was saying, because she had moments of clarity.
right.
So I don't think it was always there. Like, and I do think her husband played a lot more of a factor behind the scenes that we'll ever know, particularly now that she's in prison. She's making statements like, I told him I didn't want to have sex because the doctors told us not to. And then he would basically bully her into it and saying it was her religious duty and they needed to have more kids. And eventually she would just comply. She
Yeah.
said that she didn't want to because she might hurt her children. And he just bullied her into doing it. I think the idea of the cult of one is something that isn't talked about very much, but I think he really was trying to create his own little group of full compliance. The problem is he picked someone who was also psychotic. um,
Yes.
I think if she didn't already have the mental health issues, he absolutely could have built this cult like family following his whim with 10 kids. I think that was his plan, and he just picked the wrong one.
I think so too. And he couldn't have really known that when they got married because
Oh,
she did
right.
not have any signs of these extreme mental illnesses, which she's also been. There have been some, I read some areas that said that she has bipolar disorder, some that she has schizophrenia, some that she had postpartum psychosis, that she had just severe depression, that she
Mm-hmm.
mania. There's all kinds of things. And she has been diagnosed with multiple psychotic conditions over the years.
Yeah.
So, but they did develop over time and were exacerbated by the pregnancies and the struggles of caring for all of these little kids.
Yeah.
And I don't think that she was a good option for him. I think that they got along well in their day to day life because she was very
Mm-hmm.
submissive to whatever he wanted and
Compliant.
he liked that about
Yeah.
her, but it was at her own detriment. And
Oh, I
she
agree.
could not be perfect for him. There was no way that she could live up to what he thought that she should be. And I'm not blaming
Yeah.
Rusty for this, but I do feel like, I mean, he was not charged ultimately. He was not found to be legally responsible. But I
Yeah.
have
Because it
some,
was, oh, I completely agree. Because they never could get anything solid.
yeah,
I think a lot of reasons that I found people didn't want to give the death penalty is because they weren't confident that, like, she, A, was in her right mind, but I think also that she was independently responsible. Versus there was like a lot of questions of jealousy and revenge. And if you're doing things against, how to revenge against your husband is take his children. If you're
hmm,
jealous of the attention that the kids are getting that you feel like you should be, like, there were a lot of things that trickle back to him that I think the juries just weren't comfortable making that final call.
yeah. I mean, I'm kind of I'm kind of in two minds about it because I feel like if she had been tried somewhere else, she probably would have been not guilty by reason of insanity earlier. Like I think that in a lot of states that would have been the ruling. But in Texas, I'm kind of surprised she didn't get the death penalty because she was found to be competent, which is a huge stretch in my opinion. I do not think that she was competent then. I still don't know if she's competent now, but I think that the fact that she did not get the death penalty and in fact was going to be eligible for parole at some point is a pretty clear indication that they did not feel like she was fully responsible for this
Yeah.
because she
Yeah.
murdered five little kids in Texas. In a lot of places you would get the death penalty for that. It's a pretty
Yeah.
extreme egregious crime.
It is. But when it comes to the death penalty, it's interesting because Texas is very supportive of that. They're one of the few states that still have it on the books. However, what a lot of people just assume because of that, there isn't a lot of people on death row with that. Like, it's very, very difficult to get charged with that sentence. Um, and I think as time goes on, people are less and less comfortable about giving that out. I think there's under 200 people on death row since like the 80s. Like, and even if you get that, doesn't mean you're getting the lethal injection either. Most inmates who
Yeah,
get death row sentences just end up dying on death row and never actually get
yeah,
anything. But what a lot of people don't know is I personally would rather get a prison sentence than a not guilty by reason of insanity. Because
you don't go home.
A, you don't go home, but there's no time limit on those. Each state does do it differently, but it ranges. So some states you get not guilty of reason insanity, you're in there. I can't remember what state it is, and I don't want to guess and be wrong. But there are some states that you go in and you aren't let out until the state deems you competent. Texas is
Yes.
not one of them. Texas does a rule where if you're found not guilty due to mental disease or defect, which makes you lacking the capability to appreciate your criminality, so you don't technically know the statute that you're doing due to mental health or whatever the case is, they only are allowed to hold you in the mental hospital for the maximum sentence allowed for that crime. Granted, this specific crime is life without parole, so she's never going home. But in other cases, like if you had a option of being 10 years, it's like an automatic, all right, we're going to hold you probably for 10 years, unless you have some way to get competent. But yeah, she's going to be in there for the rest of her life without an option because of the
So,
charge that she got.
so I think that she actually have has the option to be evaluated every year. Yeah, I'm looking at an article about it now. It says that under the terms of her conviction, Yates is eligible to undergo a review each year. She has repeatedly declined to be assessed, and in 2024, she also declined it.
Yeah, so I was under the impression Texas, they allow you to do that evaluation, but they're going to hold you up to the maximum. So basically, they would go, if she was found competent, be moved to another facility and then would
Hmm.
get resentenced
Oh, maybe that's it.
versus the not guilty by reason of sanity. You're kind of held until, because just because you get tested doesn't mean you're going to A, be competent, but at that point, you know they can't hold you any longer than X.
Yeah.
So, like, if they're the sentencing was the maximum sentence was 40 years incarcerated, they cannot legally hold her. They have no jurisdiction over her over those 40 years. But the loophole is in these cases is then they can just civilly commit her. Your
Yeah.
40 years is up, you're still not competent enough. We'll civilly commit you because you've been awarded the state. You don't have your independence at that point. They can just commit you and keep you forever. So there's no end game there. And also,
That
what's
is
she going back to?
well,
What's she
nothing
going
because
back to?
also she could be tried again because she was only charged for three of the kids' murders in the
Yeah.
original trial and in the second trial because it was an appeal of that direct trial. So there are still two child murders that she could be charged with because there are no statute of limitations on murder. So it was done strategically by the state to only charge her with three of five of the murders because if something happened and she was found not guilty at the first trial, the plan was that they were going to try her again separately.
And
So
don't
they could still do
forget,
that.
her husband also divorced her during this process.
Yes. Well, yeah, he did. He divorced her. So she doesn't have
And
that to go back to.
yeah, so it was during her trial in August 2004. He filed for divorce under the basically presentation that they were no longer living together as a married couple since the day that the murders occurred. Like,
Hmm.
no kidding, man. Like, obviously. And that
Yeah.
was his justification to get divorced, and that went active as of early 2005. He was then remarried in March 2006, 3 months prior to her second trial concluding. So, like, she wasn't even done. Your kids hadn't even been dead for 5 years, and you're already remarried.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gross.
He did remarry and he had another kid. And that marriage also ended in divorce, but there's not a lot of details about it that I could find online.
No, they got, I think it was 2021 that I said that they got divorced. They only had the one kid. I will say she's very pretty, the
Yeah.
the new
They said
wife.
they filed in 2015.
Oh.
But I mean, I think that it would probably be very difficult to be married to Rusty after what he went through. Um,
Yeah, her name was Laura Arnold.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah. I'm looking at the wrong Laura Arnold on.
yeah, I just can't even imagine. Like, how do you how do you try to move on from that first in his benefit? Like, trying to move on and restart your life completely. However, I don't think that's the way to go. Like, I think he just wanted to pretend that nothing had happened and move on. And he he also had an interesting relationship with one of the ministers, and he there was questions of like wanting to have revenge coming into play, which I'd be curious if his religion and the ministers around him pushed him into getting married again. Because again, you have to have babies. Like, I'd be curious kind of what the behind the wall was that over there.
Yeah, I did not realize that they got married in the same church where the kids' funerals were. But that's what
Yeah.
this says.
Isn't that also
Wow.
icky?
Yeah,
Like, you're
that's
less
like
than 5 years ago, you were standing there burying your five children, and that's where. But again, it was a very small knit religious community. He probably didn't have very many options on where he could get married anyway.
that's true. Yeah. And they probably would have had a lot more kids if they were younger, but Laura was
She was
already
in her
40.
40s, yeah.
Yeah. So I really truly do feel so terrible for Rusty. I feel like he went through one of the worst, most unimaginable tragedies that a person could probably go through.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have some complicated feelings about his culpability and responsibility in the situation. And I'm sure even now that's a struggle for him as well. Um,
Yeah.
so I feel kind of bad saying that, but I do think that if you're being told repeatedly by doctors that your wife is psychotic and she could be a danger to your kids, which he claims was not told to him like that. He was not told that she was psychotic. He was not told that she was a danger to the kids, that he just thought that she was depressed and a danger to herself. But I don't really believe that. I really don't believe that. I don't think that you're taking your
Oh,
wife every 3 weeks to get an injection of Haldol
yeah.
if you don't know she's psychotic.
It's documented. And the two of them
Yeah,
went to the doctor and was like, hey, we want to get off this medication. This wasn't a thing that they did on their own.
right.
It was verbalized in advance. So
Yeah.
I don't agree with it at all. I think he wanted the cult of one and
Hmm.
unfortunately picked the wrong female for it. And now that all of this happened, he has to backtrack and he has to try to live with his culpability in it. I don't think he should be held to the same standard because obviously she is the one that drowned her children.
Hmm.
But I think there should be some kind of, against doctor's orders, you left that woman alone because you, the random human being, decided that you knew better than a psychiatrist and left her alone with your children. That was a conscious decision.
Yeah. I think
Like,
that he really went into that eyes wide open. I mean, he had wrestled knives out of her hands while she was trying to stab herself. He
yeah,
had thrown her in the car while she was in a psychotic fit. Like, he had seen her be completely catatonic. Like, those are signs of severe mental illness. She lost so much weight because she was unable to eat. She couldn't even eat and ensure. Like, that is
but you're
someone who,
comfortable leaving your babies with her? Mm-mm.
well, she needed a swift kick in the pants.
Ugh, vomit. But so
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. I mean, I really think that he thought that she could just like toughen up a little bit, and if he pushed her, then she would just have to rise to the occasion, and that is that was
She
not a good
snapped.
move. Yeah. Yeah. She
Mm-hmm.
snapped and she had a very short distance to get to. And she had told the doctors and police that she'd been thinking about killing the kids for 2 years. Mary wasn't even a thought at that point. So,
Yeah.
and she was still on Haldol at that point too, the first time, because she didn't go off of it until she started trying for Mary. So I think that a lot of these things were lingering, persistent issues. It came in cycles of being extremely, extremely bad versus just bad. And
Yeah.
in that book that I'm talking about, one of the doctors described Rusty as a good person, but in his acceptance of Andrea, he also is willing to tolerate a very high level of mental illness, like where it just doesn't phase him. And that is a
Yeah.
super dangerous combination. And it just had the most horrific results.
Yeah. Oh, it's so sad. It really is.
Hmm.
All right. So, what are your last thoughts when it comes to Andrea?
I feel terrible for her. I'm glad that she is confined in a mental facility. I think that even if she was stable for a long time, I would still think that she was a danger to herself and possibly other people. Um,
Yeah.
and that this is a really terrifying example of the need for postpartum psychiatric care for people who need it and for long term hospitalizations when appropriate. And I could go on all day about the limitations of insurance on medical care. But I basically feel like Andrea and her kids were failed entirely. And she was a very non compliant patient, but she was super sick and she shouldn't have been in the position to make these decisions for herself at that point. She probably needed a conservatorship. I don't think that she was well at all. And I think that Rusty just wouldn't acknowledge that. But I think that's
Yeah.
pretty
I
much it.
think
How
it
about you?
was just a really unfortunate circumstance that got pushed to the limit. And I do think he should be held accountable to a degree because at the end of the day, he was the one who left her alone and was told not to. So I think that's where I start to feel icky about it because it all could have been avoided. Part of me feels like it was inevitable, uh, but I also think it could have been done differently. Mm. Well, that was our mother of the week. I do think this is probably one of the more sad ones we've done just with the sheer number and the age. I think it's just so sad.
Yeah. And like, I don't think Andrea's evil. I think some of these other people that we've talked about are just evil completely. Whereas, yeah, absolutely. So I don't feel like the anger at her that maybe I normally would. Um, like in other cases where people like just really neglect and abuse their kids, I feel very upset with them and very angry with them. Whereas Andrea, I just pity her and feel terrible for her. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's why it's so sad. But I always found this case very, very interesting. And
I
now I kind of
know. I
want to
kind
do
of want to
find
find. I
the
don't
Law and
watch
Order
that.
episode
I
based
think
on her.
it's not the
I
normal
feel like
Law and
that's probably
Order that
pretty
I
good.
watch. Um, but I would be very curious to watch it and compare it.
Yeah, me too. Um,
Oh, I'm
I love
currently
Law and Order
rewatching
SVU,
all of
so
those.
that's what I'm hoping it is.
So good.
Oh my God, so good. I freaking love that show. I love that show. Although it kind of fell apart for me a little bit when Elliot left, but
No, I
the
think it went up and
reincorporations
down.
of
It really
him I
depends on
haven't
the
loved.
season after
So I don't
Elliot
know what
left
I want.
because I do like Sonny. I think their introduction of him was terrible, but they definitely did a good job of like building him up as a character. I like him later on. Um, but
Yeah. But when
I
he becomes a
know
lawyer,
that's
it doesn't
where
really
I
make
haven't
sense
got
how
to
much
that
he's still
redo
like being
yet.
a
But
cop.
I think that's again where they start to lose me again. It just depends on the season.
Mm, yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
I like
love that
really liked it
man.
when it was iced
That is
tea, you know.
facts.
That's
Facts.
that was my guy. Yeah. Yes. All right.
Yes, all
Well,
right. To our next
I think
mother,
that's it for now. And
right? You too.
yes, till the next